I'm Rob Forsyth, and this is Liberalism in Question, a series of podcasts from us here at the Centre for Independent Studies on issues around classical liberalism, its strengths, its weaknesses, its challenges, and its opportunities. Today I'm joined by Dr. Bird, who is in fact a New Testament scholar, but a man with great interest in a wide range of topics. And my question is going to be, why is classical liberalism on the nose, and is there something wrong with it, and what can be done about it? And I'm interested in talking with Michael because to get a particular Christian perspective, because it's often Christians who are most critical of classical liberalism. Michael, welcome to Liberalism in Question.
Great to be with you, Rob, and all of your listeners and viewers.
Is classical liberalism on the nose?
It definitely is. And what is ironic is the criticism is coming from the left and the right. So there are a lot of people who are disenchanted with the liberal tradition, and they want to see it replaced with something else, not a neoliberalism, not a chastened liberalism, but something else, either a type of Christian nationalism or something that's more hegemonic, or a kind of social contract where the state is able to be more coercive and controlling in people's consciences, morality, and civic discourse.
Mike Byrne, we've been talking about liberalism, but what does it mean? I know one thing we discovered here on this podcast is that there are many different interpretations of what we mean. What do you have in mind when you use the word classical liberalism?
And when I say liberalism, I don't mean liberalism in the sense of being simply a cipher for the political left, because in Australia our Conservative Party is called the Liberal Party, which yes. I know is very confusing to American audiences. So when I mean the liberal tradition, I mean that political tradition that places an emphasis on civic freedoms and recognizes that government power must always have certain limitations. As that applies to economics and like a free market, and as that also applies to civil rights, and also when it comes to government interference in matters of religion. So that's what I mean by the liberal tradition.
Let's talk a little bit about its criticism from the left and the right. Let's just start with the left. The left on the whole have never really bought classical liberalism, is my impression.
In some senses they did. They were very happy with the idea of personal freedoms and rights, more so recently when it came to the idea for equality on the basis of racial and sexual prejudice. They've always been on it in its favor for those reasons, but they've never been a big fan of economic liberalism, leading to a kind of laissez-faire economics where you can lead to monopolies, the strong dominate the weak, and that type of a thing. And some of those critiques, do have their place. Even within free economics, a free market, you still need some degree of regulation. You need some referee on the scene. But yeah, so the left politically have championed civil rights, but been a little bit more hawkish when it comes to full economic freedom. And you find the reverse on the traditional right, where they've tended to be very much in favor of free market absolutism. The stock market will look after itself, and they've been a little bit more cautious on civil rights, as this is simply empowering the grievances of various minorities and holding the rest to ransom. Those are the traditional critiques of liberalism from the left and the right. But what's ironic is that it has very little to do with what are the critiques today.
Yes, I'm interested in the critiques today, particularly from the right.
Yeah, I think on the right side, I think they've recognized that liberalism, the idea of free human expression, leads to fragmentation and fratricide. If you've got everyone effectively defining their own reality, doing what is right in their own eyes, living their own truth, it is incoherent, okay? And it leads to a type of breakdown in society. You can even, there's a lack of moral norms, there's a lack of law and order, and you also lose any sense of solidarity for what brings citizens together, because, and I think this is a genuine problem, is that if you're going to focus on society as a number of distinct identity groups, and every identity group must be recognized, affirmed, its grievances addressed. If you focuses on what's different about society, you have nothing to glue us together. And you see that very much in Canada under Trudeau, where Trudeau argued that Canada was the world's first post-national state. The only thing Canadians had in common was geography. There is no Canadianness. There is no Canadian way of being a citizen. The only thing they share is geography, because if you define Canadianness, that means you could potentially exclude people or say that some people are not Canadian than others. So Canada is just a collection of distinct and discrete identities, and the only thing binding them together is not values, religion, ethnicity, love for country. The only thing that bounds them together is geography.
Well, at the time of recording, just a week or two ago from the time we're recording this, that's all changed in Canada. Now suddenly, being Canadian is very important, and Trudeau's gone. And we all owe it to Mr. Trump, as I understand it.
Yes. Well, Canada now has a new Prime Minister, and he seems to be a little bit different from Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau was the progressive identitarian poster boy. I mean, he just loved that stuff. He loved that stuff.
My point was that there's something deeper in human beings that about place, about belonging, patriotism, which comes out of particularly when, in this case, a threat appeared. Suddenly when there's a threat, suddenly people were more connected in Canada, suggesting that that very thin liberalism which you're describing is in fact non-realistic.
Well, I think it's shown that you can rally people together, and Canadians do believe they have a sense of shared identity, even if it's only being unified against a common enemy like Donald Trump. But they are willing to forge bonds that bring them together and set aside differences. I think the same thing happened in America after 9/11. There was a great sense of patriotism, national unity, bipartisanship, and people did focus on Americanness when it came to bringing together. And some people would say that's only true if you have something shared amongst your citizens that can bring them together. The danger has always been that liberalism has focused on the individuality of the person, not on their collective identity or social solidarity.
Liberalism, by its very nature, is pluralist about the big questions. This has been its strength, and it's probably its weakness. It doesn't answer the question of what is the good life, is there a God, things that you and I may have very strong views on. But liberalism at the top level says, no, that is not a matter for the state to hold. It may be a matter on which the society have majority views, but that's not the same as the state. And this is what I think is a key, am I right, a key part of liberalism is this agnosticism about issues which in other societies are front and centre.
I think that's exactly right. In liberalism, the idea is we will allow every citizen to make up their own mind about what is good, about God, and about how to pursue prosperity, life, and happiness. But it becomes a little bit difficult when you've got one society. Let's say they want the restoration of a Catholic monarchy, and another part of society wants some sort of communist manifesto, put into practice.
Well, of course, I mean, liberalism. Part of the plurality of liberalism, sometimes, is having in its own societies forces which, if they're allowed to, would destroy the very liberal state itself. This is a major challenge, I think, for liberalism.
And that's always been the danger of liberalism. If you give voice and equality to dissent, you're effectively giving a heckler's veto to the people who would completely destroy your situation. Now that's been the debate, particularly with the influx of Islamic immigrants, Muslim immigrants to many countries. If many of these Muslims are happy to live under a Western liberal society, and they're happy to walk past a bikini shop, a McDonald's, and a synagogue and a church, that's fine. But when people then want to advocate for Islamicist views in Australia, that's when it does create social tension. And that's exacerbated, in certain places, particularly I think Europe and the UK right now, where Islam is becoming a significant political force. Now, you can say that's simply a corollary of multiculturalism and the fact that the British Empire is importing its own citizens back home, but it does lead to social fragmentation. It does lead to the rise of the far right, for people who have very immigrant views and even have strong feelings against any type of multiculturalism and against the liberal project itself.
So let's talk about that. It seems to me liberalism, well, I'll ask you why you believe in it in just a moment, but it's the kind of belief which by its very nature it's hard to get really excited about. And its opponents are often very excited about their solution to the world problem. Can we talk a bit about the right? And you mentioned the word Christian nationalism. I don't think that's an issue that I've noticed in Australia, but I think it is an issue in the States. Am I right?
Oh, it's definitely an issue in the States. It's not an issue. It's not an issue in Australia, because I think we have a far more secular political establishment. But in the States, yeah, there are groups and people who clearly do resonate with Christian nationalism, many of whom are currently part of the Trump White House political apparatus. J.D. Vance, I think, has some kind of affinity with it, even though he's Catholic these days. But there is a Catholic version of it. There is a Catholic, yeah, as well as a Protestant version. Yeah. There is a Catholic version of this. I'm not too sure how much traction it has amongst the House of Bishops in the United States. I don't think it's that popular at that level. But there is a kind of populist and even, pop Catholic intellectual person who is, into that kind of thing. But I just don't think it has much purchase in the upper echelons of the Catholic Church.
No. But people like Deeren, in his book, Why Liberalism Failed, is a good example of this critique. The argument would be, from that point of view, we know that this is best for society, my belief. Let's suppose I believe what I think would be best for society if all people held this view that I hold. And therefore I should do all I can to promote that view, even possibly asking the government to assist me to give me an upper hand in this matter, rather than allowing this liberal free-for-all, which means that my view may not be the best. So it's a kind of paternalistic view, isn't it, of what's best for the society. So if I believe in God and the Christian faith, I think that's the best, which I do, as a matter of fact, it turns out. But I want all to hold that view, which I also hold. Why won't I therefore want to say, okay, let's forget about liberalism, let's have some kind of imposed view? Right? That would be the argument, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and that's the argument for both the right and the left. The right says, look, the liberal project leads to social fragmentation. It leads to simply a war of mutually incommensurable identities just fighting against each other. We need something like God, King, and Country to bring us all together.
Yes.
And without that, we're gonna be just fragmented and fratricidal. But there's also a left-wing version of that as well. And the left-wing version is basically, I'm right, you're wrong, therefore I have the right to silence or destroy you. So, there's the greatest violence in the world is not done by people who believe that what they do is wicked. The greatest violence in the world is done by people who believe that what they do is righteous. And on the political left, I would say their critique of liberalism is they want to replace an equality principle before the law with a hierarchy of identities, a kind of caste system. There is a really good example of this, and it baffles me because to state it seems to be to refute it. But in Australia, in our own country, it is illegal for lesbians to have gatherings that exclude anyone with male genitalia, so whether, men or trans women, and to advocate for rights on the basis of their empirical biology rather than on the basis of an ephemeral gender identity. So this is just, I find this incomprehensible. And the Human Rights Commissioner actually supports this, that lesbians cannot petition, protest, associate for the purpose of arguing for rights on the basis of their biology, because that would be an affront to the feelings or the rights of transgender people. And so lesbians in Australia are deprived of freedom of speech, freedom of association, and freedom of to petition and protest. And that just baffles me. And if you had said this to someone 30 years ago, they would have looked and said, that could never happen. That would be impossible.
And Michael Bird, what is the justification for such a restriction?
Well, the justification is a discrimination principle that all discriminations are injustices. Okay, that's the basis of it. All discriminations are injustices.
So if I discriminate someone from my gathering or my group on the basis of their biological sex, that's illegal. That's the point you're making.
That is the point. But
How silly. Okay.
that in order to do that, you're saying the equality principle or the basic civil liberties like freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom to petition and protest, they are secondary to protecting certain identities. And the identities, the way you deal with them is by a kind of caste system. It's kind of like, a game of cards where, my dragon beats your warlock or something like that. It's that level, and it's that hierarchy of identities that has replaced basic civil liberties and the political left, and they're quite happy with it. And this just baffles me, because how you can say I stand for women's rights and even gay rights when I'm willing to punish lesbians because they want merely for suggesting that their biology matters more than their gender identity, and their rights should be based on a biology, not on a gender identity, which is largely very subjective and all about feelings.
Sure. Now, we could spend the entire podcast talking about the attacks on liberalism, before they are many and varied. But I'd like to change now and say, at the end of the day, you are convinced that classical liberalism is the correct way to run a society, and you do this as a New Testament scholar and actually an Anglican clergyman, as it turns out. Why on earth do you think that?
Well, for me, it goes down to two things. One is a religious principle, and the second one is a pragmatic principle. Religiously, Jesus tells us to love our neighbors. So the Lord Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. To love my neighbor, I have to allow my neighbor to be different to me. If I force my neighbor to follow my religion, to eat my food, to wear the same clothes I wear, to speak my language, I would argue I'm not loving my neighbor. So loving my neighbor is all about allowing them to be different to me and allowing them to be other than me. And yes, we can have a great conversation on the limits of otherness. If your religion requires you to do child sacrifice or the burning of widows, we can explain to you some reasons why that's not going to be okay.
Yes, that's right.
But so based on a religious principle, Jesus calls me to love my neighbor who is other than me. Second reason is more pragmatic. You've got to find a way to learn to live with differences. And this is what I say, to Christian nationalists. It's like, fine, if you want to make Christian nationalism hegemonic, sure. Which version of Christianity is going to be hegemonic? Do you want us Anglicans going into Baptist churches and forcibly baptizing your children, and the only way of worship you'll be allowed to perform is using the Book of Common Prayer?
I must say that's a tempting offer now. You mentioned it, Michael.
A bit of Baptist Common Prayer might be good for our Baptist brethren.
There was a time, more seriously, there was a time in which that's exactly what happened.
And America was founded so it wouldn't happen again.
Yes, that's right. And we Anglicans have grown out of it, as have the Roman Catholics, grown out of the belief that the best way is for society to prescribe. Isn't there also another issue that ultimately, if you're going to have an hegemony, you've got to have compulsion somewhere. And compulsion has to mean the threat, if not the reality, of violence.
Exactly. And even as Robespierre said, who was no fan of civil liberties, nobody likes armed missionaries. So, if you need guns and whips to impose your religion, your political system, to keep a particular type of government in power, it's not going to last long, because, the more vicious you are to your own people, the more you stoke the embers of resentment and rebellion.
So, pluralism is a fact today. It probably has always been a fact today. And because of pluralism, the only way to deal with that non-violently is effectively classical liberalism, as you're saying.
Yeah, I think pluralism does not need to be destroyed. It needs to be managed. And what you need to do is to create some common values, some common purchase, or, if you want to conserve society, give people something that's worth conserving. Give them civil liberties. Give them opportunities for economic mobility. Give them the ability to make a certain type of happiness. If you create a common set of values and a kind of, social contract, to use a better word, where the government seeks the betterment of the people and the people have a voice in the government and how it's run, and we have a good balance between civil liberties and social responsibility, I think that's going to create not necessarily a homogenous society, but a pluralism where there is a type of center, or at least there is a type of glue that holds us together with all of the differences that we may have on any given issue.
So there's got to be something in common for a liberal society to work. That's what you're saying. It's not utter, disparate liberal. It's not just individualism and that's it.
Exactly, and I will never forget what. This is going to sound really weird, but this would be my critique of the political left. You cannot run a society that operates with a view to affirming everybody's feelings. Okay, and I learned this lesson from watching an episode of The Simpsons. There was a whole episode of The Simpsons where a kind of self-help guru comes to town and tells people just to do what they feel, don't be instead of being a human being, you've become a human doing, so do what you feel. And the result is basically anarchy and social breakdown. So you cannot have a society regulated by affirming everybody's feelings. You've got to have a way of living with difference, but you've got to have some kind of concord, some sort of glue, some sort of purchase, something that people are together about in a way that's going to be unifying and forging a common identity.
So it's not pure liberal, it's not pure pluralism, it's also a sense in which I must be responsible for maintaining the very process which allows the differences themselves.
That's exactly right. And that's why you can argue that even with liberalism, you can tolerate a loyal opposition, but you cannot tolerate a disloyal opposition. So you can have a criticism of the state, but political violence against the state is one thing. You can criticize one particular group, but you cannot call for the destruction and the eradication of a particular group.
And by loyal, Mike Bird, you mean loyal to the very principles of the liberal society in which we're discussing or having the debate?
I think generally, yes. You can always argue we need a little bit more civil liberty, or you can argue we need a little bit of, a little bit less. But you've got to be committed to the liberal democratic arrangement itself rather than wanting to bring it down.
And this must mean, and here we must come towards the end of our discussion, it must mean a certain self-constraint, because I'm not going to get everything I want. The liberal society is a symbol which I must learn to restrain myself, and therefore it's, put it that way, I've got to hold myself back that others may have the freedom to move, to believe.
Yeah, look, there's going to be people who will hold views that I regard as contrary to my own views, things I may include morally repugnant. But I mean, it comes down to that old principle, like, I disagree wholeheartedly with what you have to say, but I believe in your right to say it. Now, that sort of aphorism, I think, has been lost by the far right and the far left. Today, it's I disagree with what you say, and I want to see you cancelled, destroyed, debanked, exiled, or whatever. We've lost the ability to say, I disagree with you, but I defend your right to say it. Now it's, I want to vanquish all my enemies. And that's the thing. People want a total victory. I want the other side to be expunged and eliminated. And that is one of the most illiberal things you can say.
And of course, therefore, to be a fighter for liberalism means you're a fighter for compromise, which is always not that exciting. It's much easier to be excitement for one side or the other. That's the downside. Are you at this stage? You've said, and I think you're right, that there are challenges to liberalism. Are you basically optimistic though about its future, or do you think there's a very serious existential threat to liberalism in the West?
Yeah, I do think it is an existential threat in many different places. It
Right.
in the United States, it can depend what happens in the Trump context. But like I said, there's also left-wing versions of this. If you want to say that America has a problem of seeing a right-wing diminishment of liberalism, I would also argue that Canada is a place where you risk seeing a left-wing diminishment of classical liberalism as well, where you do have a moral hierarchy of
And
identities and the sort of things I've been talking about, like
yeah,
punishing lesbians because they believe that their women's rights are biological, not gender identity. When you live in a world like that, or where your employer can sack you for things you say on social media that are maybe not politically correct. I mean, how do you say I believe in workers' rights, but I believe any boss can sack his employee if they're Catholic, if they hold the wrong political view, or if they have the wrong belief about X. So I think there's canaries in the coal mine, I think, in Canada and the USA on right-wing and left-wing attacks on liberalism. But I do hope that eventually the spotlight gets put on both, and people say, hang on a second, this is not what our nation was meant to be about. So we'll just have to see what happens in the future. But, a kind of rainbow Stalinism or a kind of neo-Christian nationalism is a possible reality in North America.
and in both cases to be abhorred. Michael Bird, thank you so much for your contribution. It's been very, very stimulating.
It's been great to talk to you with Rob and
you
all of your
too.
listeners.
I'm Rob Forsyth. This has been another edition of Liberalism in Question from us here at the Centre for Independent Studies. Nice to be talking with you.